April 12, 1945, near the Harz Mountains, central Germany. The cold spring wind cut across the ruined fields, carrying the smell of burning trucks, shattered buildings, and the distant thud of artillery. The war in Europe was nearly over, or so everyone believed. The German Reich was collapsing, Berlin surrounded, and its armies pushed back from every direction. Most American units expected cleanup operations, mopping up small pockets of resistance. But for the men of the 318th Infantry Regiment, 80th Division, the war was about to take one final, violent, completely unexpected turn, one that would soon be erased from official history. Captain Samuel, Sam, Harding, a 34-year-old officer from Ohio, stood over a map laid across the hood of a muddy Jeep. His jaw was tight, and the lines around his eyes had deepened after months of brutal winter fighting. He had seen men freeze to death in foxholes, get torn apart by machine gun fire in the Bulge, and march through towns filled with bodies hanging from trees, civilians executed by retreating SS. But today's order was different. Colonel Reynolds had delivered it moments earlier, with no explanation. You will form a forward charge and cut through German positions in the Harz passes immediately. No delays. No waiting for armor. Harding stared in disbelief. Charging into the Harz Mountains, Germany's natural fortress, without tanks, without artillery support, without air cover? It was madness. The Harz was filled with remnants of SS divisions, Hitler Youth militias, and desperate Wehrmacht pockets that refused to surrender. Intelligence reports had warned the area was turning into a last stand zone. Harding folded the map slowly. Sir, we don't have the manpower for this. We're already under strength. The colonel's eyes didn't blink. Orders from above, he said. Higher than Army Command. That's all I can tell you. Higher than Army Command? Harding felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Still, orders were orders, even insane ones. The men gathered behind a tree line at the edge of a burned-out farming village. Snow was melting, turning the ground into thick mud. Soldiers smoked nervously, adjusting their helmets, tapping rifles to keep their hands steady. There were 142 infantrymen, the remnants of 2 companies that had suffered heavy losses since December. These weren't fresh troops. These were men with hollow eyes, stained uniforms, and months of trauma carved into their expressions. Sergeant Jack Murray, Harding's closest friend and a giant of a man with a permanently raspy voice, approached him. Captain, he muttered, the boys are spooked. Charging into the Harz? Word is the Krauts pulled SS fanatics up there. Some even say they're holding civilians hostage. Harding ran a hand over his face. Orders won't change, Jack. Get everyone ready. We move in 10 minutes. Murray didn't question it. He never did, but his shoulders sagged. Well, he said, if this is it, at least the scenery's nice. Harding attempted a smile. It didn't land. 10 minutes later, the column moved forward. The forest thickened quickly, swallowing them in dense pines and jagged rocks. Harding could hear everything, the crunch of boots, the clatter of gear, the faint whistle of the wind. But above all, he sensed something else. The Germans were waiting. He could feel eyes watching from the trees. They moved through a narrow mountain pass, snow still resting in pockets along the cliffs. Harding signaled a halt. Something ahead glinted. Metal? A wire? Murray squinted. Tripwire. Mines attached. They're funneling us. Harding nodded. They want us to move through the lower valley. Which means it's a trap. Harding finished. But there was no alternate route. The mountains boxed them in tightly. As they carefully cut the wire, a faint echo drifted through the pass, at first like distant thunder. Then clearer. Marching. Harding raised his binoculars. A full German force, at least 300 soldiers, was moving into position on a ridge above them. Machine guns. Mortars. riflemen entrenched in stone bunkers. And at the center of the ridge stood something unexpected, an officer in a long black SS coat, arms behind his back, watching calmly. "Jesus," Murray whispered. "They're dug in deep. Sir, this is suicide." Harding lowered the binoculars. His heart pounded, but his mind suddenly sharpened. "They want a kill zone. They want us to panic and retreat. What's the plan, then?" Harding took a slow breath. "We don't retreat." He knelt and traced a quick sketch into the mud. "We charge straight into the lower ravine. They won't expect that. Their guns are angled for a retreat, not an advance." Sergeant Murray stared at the drawing, then at Harding. "That's insane." Harding nodded. "Yes. But it's the only way through." As preparations began, a shot cracked through the trees, sharp, clean, chilling. A rifleman near the front staggered and fell, a bullet through his helmet. The Germans had opened fire. "Positions!" Harding roared. But before anyone could dive for cover, a mortar exploded just feet from their flank, showering dirt and blood into the air. Machine gun fire erupted from both ridges. The men scrambled, slipping in mud, tripping over roots, dragging wounded comrades back behind boulders. Harding's ears rang. His vision blurred. A second mortar smashed into a tree nearby, sending splinters flying like knives. The trap had fully sprung. Harding ducked behind a rock as bullets tore through the air. He gritted his teeth. This wasn't an ambush. This was an execution. And someone, somewhere, had deliberately ordered his men straight into it. He wiped the mud from his face, grabbed his rifle, and yelled over the deafening gunfire. 318th. Fix bayonets! We're charging! Murray stared at him like he'd lost his mind, but then he grinned. "You heard the man! Fix bayonets!" Metal clicked. Feet braced. Hearts pounded. Harding rose to his full height, mud sliding from his jacket, breath steaming in the cold air. "On my command!" Bullets sliced past him like angry insects. 3! Mortars thundered. 2! German shouts echoed from the ridge. 1! Charge! And the forgotten American assault that would change the final direction of World War II began with a roar of desperate courage. The cold morning light of April 9, 1945 bled slowly across the American forward positions near the edges of the Harz Mountains. The fog clung to the tree line like a final defensive curtain, thick enough that the outlines of the forest looked more like ghosts than trees. Men of the 317th Infantry Regiment, worn from weeks of contact, stood silently beside their foxholes, waiting for news, any news, that would tell them whether the day ahead meant rest, or another brutal push. Captain Daniel Mercer stood beside a field table, rubbing warmth into his hands while the battalion operations officer unfolded a dispatch packet. "This is straight from division," the major said, tapping the papers. "Gentlemen, whatever you thought today was going to be, it's not." The officers gathered. Maps revealed a winding road cutting deep into German territory, an insignificant route, barely marked, snaking between two ridgelines. But at the far end of it sat a village, Hohenfeld, and somewhere near that village, reconnaissance aircraft had spotted enemy armor, tanks concealed under camouflage netting and forest canopy. Mercer's brows tightened. "This isn't a defensive posture," he said. "They're forming up for movement." "Exactly," the major said. "Intelligence believes the Germans are preparing a coordinated breakout toward the northeast. If they break through, they could link with forces still resisting around Magdeburg. It would stall our advance for weeks. Weeks. At this stage of the war, dragging the fight out even a few days meant more lives lost, and a chance the Soviets would sweep deeper into territory the Americans were hoping to secure first. The political stakes were growing as large as the military ones. Then came the line no one expected. "The 317th will spearhead the advance. You will take that road, breach the valley, and hit whatever armored position the Germans have staged there." Mercer stared at the major as if asking for silent confirmation. You want infantry to charge armor? Lieutenant Hale asked, breaking the tension. Infantry supported by mortars, bazookas, and aerial strikes when available, the major replied. But we all know weather has grounded half our planes this week. So yes, Lieutenant. Infantry. There was no alternative. The Germans were preparing something bigger than a retreat. They were planning a counterstrike meant to shake the American advance at its most vulnerable moment. Mercer stepped away from the group, his boots sinking slightly into the soft spring soil. The sound of distant artillery echoed across the valley, not near, but not far enough to ignore. He thought of his men, exhausted, undersupplied, but still ready. They always were. Back at the company lines, the soldiers waited as their officers returned. Private Conrad Jacobs sat cleaning his rifle, listening to the murmur of the forest. What's the word, Cap? He asked as Mercer approached. We're moving out, Mercer said plainly. We've been given the road. The squad leaders exchanged looks. The road meant exposure. It meant marching into a narrow stretch of terrain with steep rock on one side and dense pine forest on the other. A natural kill zone. Enemy armor? Sergeant Whitmore asked. Yes, Mercer answered. And whatever infantry they've hidden around it. Silence fell, a silence not of fear but of calculation. They had done impossible tasks before. But this felt different. As they prepared their gear, the sky darkened briefly as clouds rolled in. No promise of air support. Just the men, their weapons, and whatever grit remained in them. At 0930 hours they moved out. The first stretch of the route was deceptively peaceful, open fields broken by old farmhouses, the smell of wet soil in the air. Birds perched on half-collapsed fences, indifferent to the soldiers passing beneath. The road narrowed as they neared the valley. The forests pressed inward. Tall pines blocked the sunlight, casting long shadows over the trail. Sergeant Whitmore held up a fist. Halt. The men froze. Mercer moved forward quietly. Up ahead lay something half buried in mud, tank tracks. Fresh ones. He knelt, brushing aside a layer of wet earth. The grooves were deep. Heavy tank deep. Panthers, Whitmore whispered over Mercer's shoulder. At least 2. Maybe more. Mercer's jaw set. Then they're close. The forest grew unnaturally quiet. No rustle of movement, no distant engines. Just stillness. Mercer raised his hand and signaled the scouts to move ahead. Minutes passed like hours. Then a single crack echoed in the valley, the unmistakable snap of a German rifle. A scout stumbled back into view, blood on his shoulder. Contact ahead, trenches across the bend, he shouted. The ambush was seconds away. Down! Mercer roared. Gunfire erupted from the ridge to their right. German MG-42s shredded the tree bark above them. Bullets cut through branches, sending splinters raining down. The Americans dove for cover, returning fire blind at first, then with growing precision as targets flickered between the trees. The Germans weren't retreating. They were dug in, waiting. They're buying time for the armor. Lieutenant Hale shouted over the chaos. We have to break this line before the tanks roll up behind us. Mercer knew he was right. If the Panthers hit them while they were pinned here, the entire battalion could be lost in minutes. He signaled the mortar team. Smoke rounds on that ridge. Now! White plumes exploded across the tree-line, swallowing the German machine gun nests. The firing faltered but didn't stop. The enemy knew their terrain too well. We push on the left flank, Mercer ordered. Whitmore, take first platoon and swing wide. Don't stop until you hit their trenches. Whitmore nodded and led his men into the shadows of the pines. As Mercer's remaining platoons poured suppressive fire into the smoke-choked ridge, the ground began to tremble, soft at first, then unmistakably heavy. The rhythmic clanking of metal on stone drifted up the road behind the German positions. The Panther tanks were moving. Mercer felt the blood drain from his face. They were running out of time, maybe minutes. He looked back toward his men, then toward the narrow road ahead. The order he was about to give would either break the German line, or doom them all. And with a deep, steadying breath, he prepared to give it. The morning fog hung thick over the Harz Mountains, muting colors and swallowing sound. The soldiers of the 317th Infantry Regiment advanced cautiously, rifles at the ready, bayonets fixed, hearts pounding. Captain Mercer led them through the muddy trail, trying to suppress the rising panic that threatened to ripple through his men. Behind him, the distant rumble of Panther tanks grew louder, each metallic stomp echoing through the narrow mountain valley like a drum of impending doom. Corporal Hank Reynolds glanced over his shoulder and whispered to Private Tommy Larkin, "Those tanks, they're closer than I thought. Looks like they're going to roll right over us." Larkin swallowed, gripping his rifle tighter. "Sir," he muttered, "why didn't the colonel send armor support?" "Because," Mercer said quietly, "they want us to break the line, alone. They believe in the shock. That's the only way." Mercer's gaze swept the ridge above, where German troops crouched in stone bunkers and behind boulders. Machine guns already rattled sporadically, bullets slicing through tree branches, striking snow and mud. The Americans ducked instinctively, returning fire when possible, but each shot seemed insufficient. Sergeant Whitmore called out over the gunfire, "Sir, the mortars are ready! We can cover the left flank while 1st Platoon pushes the trench line." Mercer nodded. "Do it! Now! Smoke the ridge, suppress the MG nests, and keep those Krauts' heads down." Mortar rounds arced through the gray sky, landing squarely among the German positions. Plumes of white smoke and dirt erupted, and for a brief moment, the firing slowed. Mercer seized the opportunity. "Fix bayonets! Forward!" The infantry surged. Mud and snow clung to their boots. Hearts pounded. Shouts and cries of men mixed with machine gun rattle and the distant rumble of tanks. The Germans were prepared. They had dug trenches, stacked rocks, and set up overlapping fields of fire, but the Americans pressed forward with a courage that bordered on recklessness. Hank Reynolds and Tommy Larkin followed Mercer, weaving between trees, diving into shallow ditches, and returning fire whenever a German head popped into view. They reached the first trench line, and chaos erupted. Hand grenades flew, bullets tore into earth and timber. The Americans clawed forward, bayonets meeting rifle butts, rifles swung as clubs, fists pounding armored helmets. Some soldiers fell almost immediately. Blood mingled with mud and snow, painting the ground in crimson streaks. Mercer himself barely dodged a burst from a machine gun nest, feeling the wind from rounds passing inches from his head. Yet despite the casualties, the Americans pressed on, forward, always forward. Above, the German officer in the long black SS coat barked orders, gesturing frantically as Panther tanks maneuvered into position. But the Americans' unexpected assault threw the defenders into confusion. Smoke, gunfire, and shouting blurred the battlefield into a chaotic storm. Whitmore's 1st Platoon surged through the left flank, grenades landing into trenches, causing soldiers to dive or retreat. Mercer's center column reached the forward trench line, bayonets clashing with rifle butts in hand-to-hand combat. Muddy, bloody, exhausted, the Americans fought with a desperation born of months of brutal winter campaigns, men who had seen death daily and refused to let it decide their fate. The Panther tanks finally rolled into view, engines roaring, turrets rotating to fire down the narrow valley. Their main guns unleashed shells into trees and mud, sending plumes of dirt and wood flying. Mercer cursed under his breath. If the Americans hesitated now, they would be slaughtered. He spotted an overturned supply crate nearby and motioned to Larkin. "Bring the bazooka!" The young private scrambled, frost on his brow, hands shaking as he loaded the weapon. The 1st Panther towered over them, its gun aiming directly at the Americans. Mercer's mind raced. One shot, one perfectly placed rocket, could disable the tank, buying the infantry precious seconds. Larkin fired. The rocket hit squarely, the impact reverberating like thunder through the valley. The Panther shuddered, smoke curling from the damaged engine, and the Germans inside scrambled for cover. It wasn't destroyed, but it stalled the advance, just long enough for Mercer's men to close in. Amid the chaos, Mercer noticed movement along the forest edge, a German reinforcement squad attempting to flank their position. He grabbed a megaphone from a nearby supply crate. "All units! Hold the line! No retreat! Push forward and secure the ridge!" American soldiers shouted back in unison, their voices raw with adrenaline and fear. They surged again, climbing into trenches, throwing grenades, and engaging in hand-to-hand combat with stunned German defenders. The unexpected aggression had given them a critical edge. The Germans, though better positioned and armored, were now reacting rather than initiating. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. Every step forward was paid in blood. Mortar fire, machine gun bursts, and tank shells shook the ground, creating a terrifying symphony of war. Yet through it all, the Americans, dirty, exhausted, and bleeding, kept moving, relentless, unstoppable. By late afternoon, the Americans had breached the first major German trench line. Survivors crouched in shell craters, breathing heavily, trying to suppress panic. Mercer looked over his men. Out of 142 men who had started, fewer than 80 were still actively moving forward. But they had done the impossible. They had taken ground no one thought they could. And then came a sight that would haunt Mercer for the rest of his life. The German officer in the black coat, now clearly commanding the last defensive position along the ridge, raised a white flag briefly, only to lower it and signal for a countercharge. Mercer knew the battle was far from over. They had survived the first storm, but the final push, the decisive, history-changing charge, was still ahead. Through the smoke and shattered trees, the American soldiers realized something remarkable. Their charge, their courage, had disrupted German plans. By forcing the enemy to react, they had set the stage for a movement that could, and would, change the final direction of the war in Europe. The sun began to set, red-orange over the distant peaks, casting long shadows over the battlefield. Men tended the wounded where they lay. Mercer gathered the remaining officers. "Tomorrow," he said, voice steady, "we finish this. We don't just hold this line, we take the ridge. And when we do, the Germans' entire strategy collapses." No one spoke, they only nodded, exhausted but resolved. Each man carried the knowledge that they were part of something greater than themselves. A charge that history would nearly forget, but one that had already begun to alter the course of World War II. April 13, 1945, late afternoon, Harz Mountains, Germany. The air was thick with smoke, mud, and a metallic stench of blood. The American survivors of the 317th Infantry Regiment regrouped behind shattered trees and shell-cratered ground, hearts still hammering from the first clash. Captain Mercer moved among the men, checking weapons, offering terse encouragements, and silently counting the cost. The ridge loomed above them, a jagged line of rock, dirt, and steel, defended by the last organized German resistance in the valley. "This is it," Mercer muttered to Sergeant Whitmore. "Take it, and the war shifts. Fail, and we're trapped." Whitmore nodded grimly. His hands were blistered, fingers blackened with soot and mud, yet his eyes burned with determination. "We've come this far, sir. Let's finish it." The ridge was a natural fortress. German trenches zigzagged along the peaks, machine gun nests covered every slope, and pillboxes bristled with firepower. The enemy had anticipated an American advance along the valley road. Yet, thanks to the relentless charge the previous day, the Germans had been forced to commit reserves earlier than expected, scattering their forces slightly and leaving weak points that Mercer hoped to exploit. Mercer called for a quick reconnaissance. 2 scouts moved ahead, low to the ground, slipping between broken trees. Minutes later, they returned, panting. "Sir," one whispered, "left flank weak. Only a small SS unit covering it. Right side, heavily fortified, tanks still in position." Mercer traced the route with his gloved hand. "We take the left flank, surprise them, then roll forward. Whitmore, you lead the charge with 1st Platoon. Hale, you cover the center. I'll take the right and keep eyes on the tanks." The men barely had time to nod before the first mortar shells landed. Dust, splintered wood, and shrapnel showered them. The Germans had spotted movement. Mercer grabbed the field telephone, speaking quickly into it. Mortar teams, fire on the central pillboxes. Now! The valley erupted. Mortars screamed overhead, crashing into German positions, sending clouds of dirt into the frozen air. Machine gun fire faltered for the briefest moment. Mercer seized it. Charge! He bellowed. The Americans surged up the slope. Bullets tore through the trees, but the momentum carried them forward. Hand-to-hand combat erupted as they reached the trenches. Bayonets clashed with rifle butts, grenades detonated in trenches, and screams echoed across the ridge. Sergeant Whitmore led the left flank like a force of nature. His men flanked the weakened SS unit, overwhelming them before they could organize. Within minutes, the left ridge was partially secured, giving the Americans a foothold. Meanwhile, Mercer and his platoons fought their way through central trenches. The ground was slippery with mud and blood. Every step demanded vigilance. The Germans counterattacked viciously. Tanks rumbled below, firing into the slope, but American soldiers had found cover behind boulders and jagged rocks. Private Larkin's bazooka fired again. One shot struck a Panther's side armor. Smoke and fire erupted. The tank halted, forcing its crew to abandon it. Cheers erupted among the Americans, small, fleeting, but vital for morale. The decisive moment came as Mercer reached the crest of the ridge. There, he found the German officer in the long black coat from the valley assault, rallying what remained of his men. Mercer raised his rifle, aiming. The officer paused, eyes locking with Mercer's. Time seemed suspended. Around them, the valley roared, gunfire, shouts, and explosions blending into one terrifying symphony. Then Mercer remembered the first charge. The fear, the adrenaline, the desperation. He gritted his teeth and fired. The officer fell, the last organized German command in the valley gone. Without leadership, the remaining troops faltered, some surrendering immediately, others fleeing down the mountain trails. Whitmore's men secured the left flank completely. Hale's central platoon pushed forward, clearing trenches and pillboxes systematically. The tanks, stalled or destroyed, could no longer cover the retreating Germans. By sunset, the Americans held the ridge. The once strong German positions lay in ruins, trenches filled with mud, debris, and the bodies of both attackers and defenders. Smoke drifted over the peaks, orange light filtering through the haze. Mercer surveyed the ridge, chest heaving, exhaustion and disbelief battling relief. The charge had worked. Against overwhelming odds, without full support, the Americans had shattered the German defensive plan. Intelligence later revealed the enemy intended to regroup, counterattack, and delay the Allied advance for weeks. The bold, largely forgotten assault by the 317th Infantry had prevented that. Mercer walked among the men, offering short words of praise, but mostly just nodding silently. He knew the cost. Over half of the regiment had been killed or wounded, and many more traumatized. Yet the result was undeniable. The ridge was theirs, the enemy's strategy disrupted, and the path toward final victory in central Germany was now open. As darkness fell, Mercer sent messengers back to division headquarters with reports of the victory. Every soldier found a moment to rest where they could, listening to the distant echoes of artillery and faint German retreat cries. In his journal that night, Mercer wrote, "We were told it was impossible. We were told to advance without sufficient support. Yet, against every calculation, against every expectation, we did the unthinkable. Today, a forgotten charge changed the direction of the war. Tomorrow, the world may never know it, but we know." And somewhere in the distant villages below, scattered German survivors whispered among themselves, realizing that their carefully planned withdrawal had failed. The American charge had rewritten their final strategy, and the war itself was closing in faster than they could comprehend. Dawn broke over the ridge with an eerie calm. The smoke from the previous day's battle hung low in the valleys, curling like ghostly fingers through shattered trees. For the men of the 317th Infantry Regiment, this morning brought silence, but not peace. Every step across the mud, snow, and debris reminded them of the staggering toll. Bodies of the fallen were strewn across the slope, American and German alike, a grim testament to the cost of the forgotten charge. Captain Mercer moved among his troops, counting heads, checking rifles, and offering brief words of encouragement. Sergeant Whitmore knelt beside a stretcher, adjusting bandages on a wounded soldier. "They're going to make it," Whitmore murmured, his voice low. "We've held the ridge. That's all that matters." Mercer shook his head, exhaustion and adrenaline mingling. "No," he said quietly. "It's not just holding. Today, we push further. The Germans are retreating, but we need to ensure they can't regroup." By mid-morning, scouts reported movement in the lower valley. Small groups of German infantry, exhausted and disorganized, were attempting to escape the mountains toward the northeast. Tank wrecks and artillery left behind slowed their advance, but Mercer knew that even a small regroup could prolong the conflict. He called a quick meeting of the remaining officers. "We split into pursuit teams," he ordered. "Whitmore takes the left ridge trail. Hale, you and your platoon move through the valley. I'll take the center and follow the main road. We hit them before they can organize. No prisoners beyond immediate threat, stop them from reforming." The men nodded. Morale was fragile but determined. Each had witnessed the horrors of the charge and survived. Now they were driven by the knowledge that this pursuit could prevent further bloodshed down the line. The valley was a maze of shattered farms, bombed-out roads, and collapsed bridges. German soldiers stumbled through the terrain, often disoriented and leaderless. American troops pursued relentlessly, using every advantage the terrain allowed. Mercer's center platoon spotted a group of retreating soldiers attempting to regroup near a small farmhouse. "Open fire!" Mercer shouted. Bullets tore through doorframes and windows. The Germans scattered, some surrendering, others fleeing into the forest. Larkin fired a bazooka at an abandoned armored car left on the road. The vehicle erupted in flames, preventing its use in the enemy's retreat. Whitmore's team moved stealthily along the ridge, picking off any German soldiers attempting to flank the Americans. By coordinating with the central column, the pursuit became methodical yet brutal, squeezing the remnants of the German forces into tighter spaces. During the advance, Mercer noticed a civilian village partially occupied by German soldiers. The villagers watched in terror, unsure whether the Americans would harm them or be repelled. Mercer signaled for his men to avoid civilian casualties, understanding that this was war, but with rules still intact. "Focus on combatants," he whispered. The pursuit revealed something unexpected: documents, maps, and equipment abandoned in haste. German officers' briefcases contained orders, reports, and plans outlining a broader strategy to fortify the northeastern escape routes. Capturing these documents would prove crucial for the Allied High Command. Private Reynolds paused to examine one of the papers, muttering, "They didn't expect us to take the ridge so fast." "This is gold." Mercer nodded grimly. "And that's why this charge will matter long after we leave this valley." By late afternoon, the Germans were completely routed. Small pockets of resistance attempted sporadic counterattacks but were swiftly overwhelmed. The ridge and valley were secured, the route northeast effectively blocked. The Americans had suffered staggering losses. Over half of the original 317th Infantry Regiment had been killed or wounded, many men still bleeding, exhausted, or limping from injuries. Yet the mission had succeeded. The ridge was held, the German counterstrike foiled, and the enemy's plan to delay Allied advancement had collapsed. Mercer walked the ridge, surveying the battlefield. The valley below was a somber scene, smoke curling from destroyed tanks, scattered weapons, and shattered defenses. He realized the significance of what they had accomplished. The Americans had turned what might have been a costly, forgotten engagement into a decisive action that directly influenced the course of the war in central Germany. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Mercer convened the remaining men. They were cold, filthy, and exhausted, but their eyes burned with determination. "Men," he said, voice hoarse, "today we did something the world will almost never know. You survived impossible odds. You faced death and chaos head-on. We've changed the direction of this war, whether anyone writes it down or not. Rest now, because tomorrow we continue toward the heart of Germany." The soldiers nodded in silence, some weeping quietly. others staring at the horizon, knowing that the battle was only one of many, and that each step forward would bring them closer to the end of a conflict that had already demanded too much. Even in the aftermath, Mercer understood the truth. History often forgets acts of courage performed in obscurity, but the consequences ripple through time. The ridge they had captured, the enemy forces they had shattered, and the intelligence they had seized were all pieces in a puzzle that would hasten the end of the war. As night fell over the Harz Mountains, fires burned in abandoned German vehicles, the faint sounds of the forest returning, and the surviving Americans prepared for their next push. The forgotten charge had become a turning point, not widely recognized, but historically decisive. April 15, 1945, Harz Mountains, Germany. The morning air was crisp but carried a heavy silence. The ridge, now firmly in American hands, overlooked the valley below, a scene of devastation that spoke louder than any report or dispatch. Smoke still rose from wrecked vehicles, shattered artillery, and toppled German defenses. Mercer walked slowly along the crest, boots crunching over debris, mud, and snow-stained earth, reflecting on the harrowing events of the past 3 days. Sergeant Whitmore joined him, wiping soot and sweat from his brow. "It's quiet," he muttered. "Too quiet." "Quiet," Mercer agreed, "is the kind you get after you survive hell. But it's also the kind that tells you the enemy is done. The Germans won't mount another counterattack here." The ridge had not just been captured, it had been transformed into a linchpin for the final American advance into central Germany. Intelligence recovered during the pursuit revealed maps, orders, and radio codes showing that the German High Command had planned a massive northeastern breakout. Without this ridge, those plans could have delayed the Allies for weeks, possibly altering the final direction of the war. As the survivors patrolled the ridge and the surrounding valley, Mercer saw the cost in human terms. Faces were pale, hands blistered, uniforms tattered and stained with mud and blood. Private Larkin, who had fired the bazooka against the Panther tanks, limped along, using his rifle for support. Corporal Reynolds sat beside a burned-out supply truck, staring blankly into the smoke, still shaken by the carnage. "Captain," Whitmore said, "we held the ridge, destroyed the tanks, and captured the enemy documents. Strategically, we won. But so many men." His voice faltered. Mercer nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. This isn't about glory. It's about survival and completing the mission. Every man who fell made this possible for the rest of us." He turned to the horizon. The sun was beginning to rise over the distant valleys, casting long shadows through the broken trees. The Harz Mountains, once a natural fortress for the Germans, now bore the mark of American resolve. By midday, messengers and supply convoys began to arrive. Division headquarters sent commendations for bravery, but nothing would fully capture the magnitude of what had happened. The charge that had begun with 142 men had reduced the regiment by more than half. Yet their courage had disrupted German strategy, prevented a potential breakthrough, and opened the path for faster Allied movement into central Germany. Mercer held a brief assembly with the surviving men. "Listen," he said, voice raw with exhaustion. "History may not remember our names, and the reports may gloss over the details, but today, we did something remarkable. Against impossible odds, we executed a charge that changed the war. That's a fact. Remember it, even if no one else does." The men stood in silence. Some nodded, some stared into the distance, and some allowed themselves the first tears they had shed in weeks. That evening, as the last light faded from the mountains, Mercer took a moment to write in his journal. "Few will remember the ridge, the charge, the blood and mud, or the bravery of men who were exhausted and outnumbered. Yet this ridge, this assault, this forgotten charge, these altered the final movements of the war in central Germany. Sometimes history remembers battles by their size or their fame. Sometimes it forgets the brave few whose courage decides outcomes unseen by the world." Whitmore approached, carrying a blanket for Mercer. "We did it," he said simply. "Yes," Mercer replied. "We did it. And now we move forward. The war won't last much longer, but what we did here, It echoes far beyond this ridge. In the weeks that followed, Allied forces swept across the northeastern plains of Germany with minimal resistance. German units were in full retreat, demoralized, and scattered. The ridge, captured by the forgotten American charge, had broken the enemy's plans completely, hastening the end of the war in Europe. Yet, despite its significance, the charge remained largely unknown outside the men who survived it. Official reports focused on broader operations, leaving the heroism, sacrifice, and tactical brilliance of the 317th Infantry Regiment largely unrecorded in history books. Captain Mercer often reflected on the battle in later years. He visited the ridge once more, long after the war, finding it quiet and overgrown, the valley beneath calm and peaceful. The ghosts of that spring, the fallen, the fear, the courage, lingered in memory, even if they were invisible to the world. He knew then what few others would ever understand. Sometimes, the smallest, forgotten actions, like a single, desperate charge up a mountain ridge, can alter the course of history forever. The ridge had been taken. The Germans had been stopped. And the forgotten American charge had, silently but decisively, changed the final direction of World War II.